The morning sun cast long shadows across the Rocky Mountain terrain when Captain Sarah Chen realized she was completely alone. The silence was deafening after 3 days of constant gunfire and explosions. Her unit had been conducting a covert reconnaissance mission deep in hostile territory when everything went wrong. The ambush had come from nowhere. One moment they were moving through the valley, following what their intelligence had marked as a safe route. The next moment, the world exploded around them. Machine gun fire erupted from 3 directions, and mortar rounds began dropping with deadly accuracy. Sarah pressed herself against a large boulder, her tactical radio crackling with static. She tried calling for backup, for extraction, for anyone who might be listening. Nothing but dead air answered her calls. The enemy had been jamming their communications for the past hour. Through the chaos, she had watched her team fall one by one. Lieutenant Rodriguez took a sniper round to the chest while trying to flank the enemy position. Sergeant Williams stepped on an improvised explosive device that had been cleverly hidden beneath loose rocks. Staff Sergeant Kim made it almost to the extraction point before a rocket-propelled grenade turned his world into fire and smoke. Sarah was the last one standing, and her situation was getting worse by the minute. Enemy soldiers were closing in from multiple directions, their voices echoing off the mountain walls as they coordinated their search. They knew someone from the American team was still alive, and they were determined to find her. She checked her equipment with practiced efficiency. 2 magazines left for her rifle, 1 for her sidearm. Her medical kit was intact, but her water supply was running dangerously low. The GPS unit had taken shrapnel during the initial attack and was showing error messages. Her backup compass was still functional, but getting home would require much more than just knowing which direction was north. The enemy voices were getting closer. Sarah made a decision that would either save her life or end it quickly. Instead of trying to hide and hope for rescue, she would move. The mountains stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, but she knew that somewhere beyond those peaks was friendly territory and safety. She waited until the enemy patrol passed her hiding spot, then began moving in the opposite direction. Her military training had taught her to think like the enemy would think. They would expect her to try the most direct route home, following the valleys where movement was easier. They would set up ambushes along the obvious paths. Sarah chose the hardest route instead. She would go up and over the mountains, through terrain so difficult that the enemy would assume no one would be crazy enough to attempt it. She was counting on their assumption being wrong. The first day of climbing nearly broke her. The rocky slopes were steep and treacherous, covered with loose stones that threatened to send her tumbling hundreds of feet with every step. Her military boots, designed for desert operations, struggled to find purchase on the smooth rock faces. By the time the sun began to set, Sarah had climbed higher than she had ever been in her life. The air was thin, making every breath a conscious effort. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and she knew that exposure would kill her just as surely as enemy bullets. She found a small cave formed by 2 massive boulders leaning against each other. It was barely large enough for her to lie down, but it would provide protection from the wind and hide her from any patrols that might be looking for her tracks. As she settled in for the night, Sarah allowed herself to think about home for the first time since the ambush. Her younger brother Tommy was probably in his senior year of high school now, playing football just like she had done. Her parents would be worried sick when they got the news that her unit was missing in action. She had joined the Army right after high school, driven by a desire to serve her country and prove that she was tough enough to handle anything the military could throw at her. Growing up as the only girl in a family of boys, she had learned early that she would have to work twice as hard to earn half the respect. The military had been different than she expected. Some of her fellow soldiers had doubted her abilities at first, but she had proven herself through countless training exercises and 2 previous deployments. Her commanding officers respected her tactical skills and her ability to stay calm under pressure. Now she was facing the ultimate test. Everything she had learned, every skill she had developed, every lesson she had absorbed was going to be put to the ultimate test. She was alone in enemy territory with no backup, no support, and no guarantee that anyone even knew she was alive. The night was brutally cold. Sarah had packed light for the reconnaissance mission, which meant her cold weather gear was minimal. She had a lightweight sleeping bag, but it was designed for moderate temperatures, not the freezing conditions she was now facing. She stayed awake most of the night, doing small exercises to keep her blood flowing and watching for any signs of enemy movement. Every sound made her heart race, but it was mostly just the wind whistling through the rocks and the occasional call of a night bird. When dawn finally came, Sarah was exhausted, but alive. She ate a small portion of her remaining food supplies and took careful sips from her water bottle. She would have to find water soon, or dehydration would become a serious problem. The second day of climbing was even more challenging than the first. The mountains seemed to go on forever, each peak revealing another even higher peak beyond it. Sarah forced herself to think of it as just another training exercise, breaking the enormous distance down into manageable segments. She would focus on reaching the next ridge, then the next outcrop of rocks, then the next patch of relatively flat ground. She refused to think about the hundreds of miles that still lay ahead of her. Around midday, she heard the unmistakable sound of helicopters in the distance. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Maybe it was a rescue mission, maybe someone had figured out where she was, but as the sound grew closer, she realized these were enemy aircraft, almost certainly searching for her. Sarah pressed herself against a cliff face, trying to make herself invisible against the gray rock. The helicopter passed directly overhead, so close that she could see the faces of the crew through the windows. They were scanning the terrain methodically, looking for any sign of movement or disturbance. She remained motionless for what felt like hours after the helicopter disappeared over the next ridge. When she finally continued climbing, she was even more careful about staying concealed and avoiding any actions that might leave tracks that could be spotted from the air. That evening, she found something that might save her life. A small stream of clear water was running down the mountainside, fed by snowmelt from the higher peaks. Sarah filled her water bottles and allowed herself to drink freely for the first time in 2 days. She also caught her first glimpse of the valley on the other side of the mountain range. It was still impossibly far away, but it was there. She could see green vegetation in the distance, which meant lower altitude and warmer temperatures. More importantly, it meant she was making progress toward friendly territory. The third day brought a new challenge. The weather turned violent without warning, as mountain weather often does. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, and soon Sarah was struggling through driving rain that made every rock surface slippery and dangerous. The storm also brought something unexpected. The rain was washing away her tracks almost as quickly as she made them, which would make it much harder for enemy patrols to follow her trail. Nature was providing cover that she couldn't have achieved on her own. But the rain also made travel much more dangerous. Twice she nearly slipped and fell down steep slopes that would have meant certain death. Her hands were numb with cold, making it difficult to maintain her grip on the wet rocks. She was beginning to understand why this route was considered impassable. It wasn't just the physical challenge of the climb. It was the combination of altitude, weather, treacherous terrain, and the psychological pressure of knowing that one mistake would end everything. As she struggled through the storm, Sarah began to understand something important about herself. She wasn't going to give up. No matter how difficult the journey became, no matter how impossible the odds seemed, she was going to keep moving forward. The enemy had made a critical mistake when they assumed that one lone American soldier would be easy to hunt down and capture. They didn't understand the kind of person they were dealing with. Sarah Chen had been underestimated her entire life, and she had made a career out of proving people wrong. She was going home, and anyone who tried to stop her was going to discover that they had made a very serious error in judgment. The journey was just beginning, and she was already proving that the human spirit was capable of extraordinary things when survival was on the line. The storm finally passed as the sun was setting on her third day in the mountains. Sarah found shelter in another small cave and prepared for another cold night. She was exhausted, hungry, and still hundreds of miles from safety. But she was alive. She was free. And she was moving in the right direction. The enemy was looking for her in all the wrong places, while she was taking a route that would bring her closer to home with each passing day. As she settled in for the night, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. They had left her to die in enemy territory, but they had seriously underestimated what one determined American soldier could accomplish. Her journey home was going to be legendary, and it was just getting started. The fourth morning brought Sarah face to face with a problem that could end her journey before she made it halfway home. She had been rationing her food carefully, but the physical demands of mountain climbing were burning through her energy reserves faster than she had calculated. Her emergency rations were designed to sustain a soldier for 3 days of normal activity. She was now on day 4 of the most physically demanding challenge of her life. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. At her current rate of consumption, she would run out of food within 2 days. It would take her at least 2 weeks to reach friendly territory. Sarah sat on a rocky outcrop as the sun came up, studying the terrain ahead and considering her options. She could try to move faster, pushing herself harder to cover more ground each day, but that would burn even more calories and might lead to injuries that could leave her stranded. Or she could find another source of food. The mountains were not completely barren. She had seen small animals, birds, and signs of vegetation in some of the lower areas. Her survival training had covered basic hunting and foraging techniques, but theory and practice were very different things. She made her decision quickly. Military training had taught her that hesitation was often more dangerous than taking imperfect action. She would supplement her rations by living off the land, using every skill she had learned to extend her food supply as long as possible. The first opportunity came sooner than expected. While working her way down a steep slope toward a valley that promised easier travel, Sarah spotted movement in the rocks below. A small rabbit was feeding on the sparse vegetation that grew in the shelter of a boulder field. Sarah had qualified as an expert marksman with her rifle, but shooting the rabbit would create noise that might attract enemy patrols. She would have to get closer and use more primitive methods. She spent the next hour slowly working her way into position, moving so carefully that she barely disturbed a single pebble. When she was close enough, Sarah used a technique her grandfather had taught her during childhood camping trips. She collected several stones and practiced the throwing motion until she was confident. The first stone missed, but the second caught the rabbit cleanly. It was her first meal that didn't come from a military ration package. The success gave her confidence that she could survive in this hostile environment using skills that went beyond traditional military training. Her grandfather had been a hunter and outdoorsman who believed that modern people had forgotten too many of the basic skills their ancestors had taken for granted. As a child, Sarah had sometimes been impatient with his lessons about reading animal tracks, identifying edible plants, and finding water in unexpected places. Now she was grateful for every piece of knowledge he had shared with her. Over the next several days, Sarah developed a routine that balanced progress toward home with the necessities of survival. She would travel during the early morning and late afternoon when temperatures were more manageable and she was less likely to be spotted by aircraft. During the hottest part of the day, she would rest in whatever shelter she could find and work on extending her food supplies. She learned to identify several types of edible plants and became quite skilled at catching small animals and birds. The mountain environment was teaching her lessons that no military training course had ever covered. She learned to read the weather patterns by watching cloud formations and wind directions. She discovered that certain types of rock formations were more likely to have water sources nearby. Most importantly, she began to think like the indigenous people who had lived in these mountains for thousands of years before modern armies had arrived. Instead of fighting against the environment, she learned to work with it, using its natural features to her advantage. On the 7th day, Sarah encountered her first major obstacle. She had been following a ridge line that offered good views of the surrounding terrain when she came to a deep canyon that blocked her path. The gorge was too wide to cross and too steep to climb down safely. She could go around it, but that would add several days to her journey and take her through areas where she might be more easily detected. Or she could try to find a way across. Sarah spent most of the morning scouting along the canyon rim, looking for any possibility. She found her answer in the form of a fallen tree that bridged the narrowest part of the gorge. The log was solid enough to support her weight, but it was barely 18 inches wide and stretched across a drop of more than 200 feet. Sarah had never been afraid of heights, but this was different from anything she had ever attempted. There were no safety ropes, no backup plans, and no second chances. If she fell, the journey would end immediately. She approached the crossing with the same methodical planning she would use for any military operation. She studied the log carefully, testing its stability and looking for any signs of rot or weakness. She planned exactly where she would place each step and how she would maintain her balance. When she was ready, Sarah removed her heavy pack and threw it across the canyon first. If something went wrong, she didn't want the extra weight throwing off her balance. Then she started across, one careful step at a time. Halfway across, a gust of wind threatened to knock her off balance. Sarah dropped to her hands and knees and crawled the rest of the way, refusing to let pride override common sense. When she reached the other side, she allowed herself a few minutes to enjoy the accomplishment before retrieving her pack and continuing the journey. The crossing marked a turning point in more ways than one. Sarah realized that she was becoming comfortable in this environment that had seemed so hostile just a week earlier. She was adapting, learning, and overcoming obstacles that would have seemed impossible when the journey began. She was also beginning to understand that her enemy had made a critical miscalculation. They had assumed that isolating her in the mountains would make her helpless, but the opposite was proving true. Every day in this environment was making her stronger, more resourceful, and more determined. On the 10th day, Sarah encountered other people for the first time since the ambush that had killed her team. She was approaching a small village that sat at the intersection of two valleys when she spotted smoke rising from cooking fires. She spent several hours observing the settlement from a concealed position on the hillside above. The people appeared to be civilians, mostly women and elderly men, with a few children playing in the dusty streets. But Sarah knew that appearances could be deceiving in a war zone. The villagers might be innocent non-combatants, or they might be supporters of the enemy forces that were hunting her. Even if they were neutral, turning her over to the authorities might seem like the safest course of action for people who just wanted to avoid trouble. Sarah made the decision to avoid the village entirely, even though she knew the people might have food, medical supplies, or information that could help her. The risk was too great, and she had learned that she could survive without their help. She circled around the settlement, staying high on the mountainside where the terrain was too difficult for casual pursuit. It added an extra day to her journey, but it was the prudent choice. She was learning to balance audacity with caution, taking calculated risks rather than unnecessary ones. 2 days later, her careful planning paid off in an unexpected way. Sarah was resting in a cluster of boulders when she heard voices approaching from below. A patrol of enemy soldiers was working its way up the mountainside, following a trail that would have brought them directly to her position if she had taken the easier route. She counted at least 8 men, all heavily armed and moving with the confidence of soldiers who knew the local terrain well. They were spread out in a standard search formation, checking every possible hiding place as they advanced. Sarah realized that they were not conducting a random patrol. They were following her trail, which meant they had found some trace of her passage despite all her efforts to move without leaving signs. She was being hunted by professionals who knew their business. She waited motionless as the patrol passed less than 50 yards from her hiding place. When they were gone, she studied the route they had taken and began to understand how they were tracking her. They were not following her footprints or other obvious signs. Instead, they were using local knowledge to predict where someone in her situation would likely travel. They knew which routes offered the best combination of speed and concealment, and they were systematically checking each possibility. Sarah realized she would have to change her strategy completely. Instead of trying to be invisible, she would have to be unpredictable. She would take routes that made no tactical sense, travel at times when movement was normally inadvisable, and make decisions that would confuse anyone trying to anticipate her actions. The new approach felt wrong to everything her military training had taught her, but it was the only way to stay ahead of pursuers who knew the terrain better than she did. She began moving at night when possible, even though it was more dangerous and slower. She also started leaving false trails deliberately, taking obvious routes for short distances before doubling back and taking a completely different path. If the enemy was going to track her, she would make the job as difficult as possible. The psychological game became as important as the physical challenge of crossing the mountains. Sarah found herself thinking several moves ahead, like a chess player trying to anticipate her opponent's strategy. She was learning to outthink enemies who had every advantage except one. They didn't understand the kind of person they were dealing with. They saw one isolated American soldier and assumed she would behave predictably, following the standard procedures and making the logical choices. They were wrong. Sarah Chen had been underestimated before, and she had made a career out of exceeding expectations. She was not just trying to survive a difficult journey. She was proving that human determination and adaptability could overcome seemingly impossible odds. On the 14th day, Sarah reached the highest point of her journey. From a rocky peak that rose above the surrounding mountains, she could see for dozens of miles in every direction. Behind her lay the hostile territory where her team had died, and she had begun this incredible journey. Ahead of her, the mountains gradually gave way to lower hills and then to green valleys where she might find friendly forces and safety. The view confirmed that she was more than halfway home, but it also showed her that the most difficult part of the journey still lay ahead. The mountains had been challenging, but they had also provided concealment and isolation from her enemies. As she moved into more populated areas, she would face new dangers and new decisions about who to trust and when to reveal herself. Sarah took one last look back at the peaks she had crossed and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had accomplished something that her enemies had believed was impossible. She had survived in conditions that would have defeated most people, and she had done it using nothing but her training, her intelligence, and her refusal to give up. The journey was far from over, but she was no longer the same person who had hidden behind a boulder while her team died around her. She had been tested by one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, and she had proven that the human spirit could triumph over circumstances that seemed hopeless. Now she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Her enemies had tried to leave her to die in their territory, but they were about to discover that they had only succeeded in creating a legend that would be remembered long after this war was over. The descent from the high mountains brought Sarah into a completely different world. After 2 weeks of rocky peaks and thin air, the lower elevation seemed almost tropical in comparison. The vegetation was thicker, the air was warmer, and for the first time since her ordeal began, she could hear the sounds of civilization in the distance. But civilization also meant new dangers. The scattered farms and small towns in the foothills were likely to have enemy soldiers, checkpoints, and civilian informants who might report her presence to the authorities. Sarah could no longer rely on the isolation that had protected her in the mountains. She spent most of the 16th day watching a small farming community from a hidden position in the tree line above the valley. The settlement was larger than the village she had avoided earlier, with perhaps 24 buildings and signs of regular vehicle traffic on the dirt roads that connected it to the outside world. Sarah could see that the people were living their daily lives much as they had before the war arrived in their region. Children played in the streets while adults worked in gardens and tended to livestock. But she also noticed details that revealed the reality of their situation. There were no young men visible anywhere in the village. The population consisted entirely of women, children, and elderly men, which suggested that the military-age males had been conscripted, fled, or worse. This was a community that had already paid a heavy price for the conflict that had brought Sarah to their doorstep. More importantly, she spotted at least 2 uniformed soldiers who appeared to be stationed in the village on a permanent basis. They were not conducting patrols or searches, but their presence meant that any stranger would be noticed immediately and reported to higher authorities. Sarah made the decision to avoid the village entirely, even though she could see that the people probably had food, medical supplies, and information that could be valuable to her. The risk was simply too great, and she had proven that she could survive without help from outsiders. She began traveling exclusively at night, using darkness to conceal her movements through the increasingly populated landscape. The technique required her to move more slowly and carefully, but it also allowed her to observe enemy positions and patrol patterns without being detected. During the day, she would find concealment in abandoned buildings, dense vegetation, or natural features that provided both cover and a good view of the surrounding area. She was learning to think like a guerrilla fighter, using stealth and intelligence to overcome superior numbers and firepower. On the 18th night, Sarah encountered her most dangerous situation since leaving the mountains. She was crossing an open field when spotlights suddenly blazed to life around her. Enemy soldiers shouted commands in their native language as they emerged from concealed positions on all sides. Sarah dove for cover behind a low stone wall that marked the boundary between 2 fields. Bullets whined over her head and struck the ground around her as she tried to assess the situation. The enemy had set up an ambush along what they correctly guessed was a likely infiltration route, but they had made one critical mistake. They had positioned their ambush to catch someone trying to sneak through the area, but they had not considered what would happen if their target decided to fight back with professional military skills. Sarah had been trained by some of the finest combat instructors in the American military. She understood small unit tactics, marksmanship, and battlefield psychology better than most of the soldiers who were now hunting her. The fact that she was outnumbered was less important than the fact that she was better trained. She began moving immediately, using a technique called fire and movement that was designed to confuse enemies who expected their targets to stay pinned down by superior firepower. Instead of remaining behind the wall, Sarah sprinted to a new position while firing short, accurate bursts at the muzzle flashes of her enemies. The tactic worked exactly as her instructors had promised. The enemy soldiers were expecting to fight a desperate refugee who would panic under fire. Instead, they found themselves engaged with a combat veteran who was using their own ambush positions against them. Sarah worked her way systematically around the perimeter of the ambush, forcing the enemy soldiers to reveal their positions, while she remained mobile and difficult to target. She was not trying to win a pitched battle against superior numbers. She was trying to create enough confusion and casualties to break contact and escape. The fight lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. When Sarah finally reached the tree line on the far side of the field, she had eliminated at least 3 enemy soldiers and wounded several others. More importantly, she had broken through their containment and was once again free to continue her journey. But the engagement had cost her precious ammunition and revealed her position to enemy forces throughout the region. Sarah knew that every military unit for miles around would soon be looking for her with renewed intensity. She would have to change her tactics again to stay ahead of the massive manhunt that was certainly coming. She decided to do something that would seem completely irrational to anyone trying to predict her movements. Instead of running away from the area where she had been discovered, Sarah moved deeper into enemy-controlled territory, heading toward what her military training told her would be the most heavily defended positions. The logic was counterintuitive, but sound. The enemy would expect her to flee toward friendly lines as quickly as possible, so they would concentrate their searches along the most direct routes toward the border. They would not expect her to move toward their major bases and supply centers. For 3 days, Sarah traveled through the heart of enemy territory, passing within sight of military installations that could have ended her journey immediately if she had been detected. But her audacious strategy worked perfectly. The enemy was looking for her everywhere, except where she actually was. She also discovered something that would prove crucial to the final phase of her journey. By observing enemy supply convoys and communication traffic, Sarah was able to piece together valuable intelligence about their operational patterns and security procedures. This information would be worth much more than just her own safe return. The intelligence she was gathering could save the lives of other American soldiers and contribute to the overall war effort. Her mission was no longer just about survival. It had become something much more important. On the 22nd day, Sarah reached the most dangerous part of her entire journey. She had to cross a heavily fortified border zone that separated enemy territory from the neutral area where she might find friendly forces or international peacekeepers. The border was marked by multiple lines of defense, including minefields, razor wire, guard towers, and regular patrols by well-trained soldiers. It was designed to prevent exactly the kind of unauthorized crossing that Sarah was attempting. She spent 2 full days observing the border defenses, mapping patrol schedules, and identifying the least defended crossing points. The intelligence gathering required patience and attention to detail that went far beyond normal military training. Sarah discovered that the border guards followed a predictable routine that created brief windows of opportunity for someone with the skills and determination to exploit them, but the timing would have to be perfect, and she would only get one chance. She chose her moment carefully, waiting for a shift change that left one sector temporarily under-supervised. Sarah cut through the wire obstacles using tools she had improvised from materials found during her journey. She crossed the minefield by following the exact path used by a supply truck she had observed earlier. When motion sensors detected her presence in the final security zone, Sarah was already through the perimeter and moving toward friendly territory. Enemy soldiers responded quickly, but they were searching an area that she had already left behind. 24 hours later, Sarah Chen walked into an American forward operating base, ending a journey that had covered more than 300 miles of the most difficult terrain imaginable. The soldiers at the gate could hardly believe what they were seeing. According to official records, Captain Chen had been killed in action 3 weeks earlier, along with the rest of her reconnaissance team. Her appearance at the base gate was like seeing a ghost, especially considering her obvious physical condition and the story she had to tell. Sarah had lost more than 30 pounds during her journey. Her uniform was torn and patched with improvised repairs, and her equipment showed the wear of constant use in harsh conditions. But her eyes were clear, her bearing was confident, and her debriefing would provide intelligence that would change the course of several military operations. The story of her survival and escape spread through the military community faster than official reports could travel through command channels. Soldiers who heard the details could hardly believe that one person had accomplished what Sarah had done with nothing but standard equipment and extraordinary determination. Military analysts who studied her route were amazed that she had chosen a path that was theoretically impossible for a single person to traverse. The combination of extreme terrain, hostile forces, and limited resources should have made success completely unlikely. But Sarah had succeeded because she understood something that her enemies had failed to grasp. Human beings are capable of extraordinary achievements when they refuse to accept defeat. The limitations that seem absolute can be overcome by someone who is willing to adapt, learn, and persist in the face of seemingly hopeless circumstances. The intelligence she had gathered during her journey proved to be incredibly valuable. Her observations of enemy supply lines, communication patterns, and security procedures led to several successful operations that disrupted their activities throughout the region. More importantly, her story became a legend that inspired other soldiers who found themselves in desperate situations. The tale of Captain Sarah Chen's impossible journey home proved that individual courage and determination could triumph over overwhelming odds. Military historians who later studied her case identified several factors that contributed to her success. Her physical fitness and military training provided the foundation, but they were not sufficient by themselves. Sarah had also drawn on childhood experiences, family traditions, and personal qualities that went beyond anything the Army had taught her. She had refused to think of herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Instead, she had taken responsibility for her own survival and had made a series of decisions that turned a desperate situation into an opportunity to prove what human beings could accomplish. The enemy soldiers who had left her to die in their territory had made a fundamental error in judgment. They had assumed that one isolated American would be helpless in an environment where they held every advantage. They had not considered the possibility that she would turn their own territory into her training ground. Sarah's journey had transformed her from a soldier following orders into a legend that would inspire others for generations to come. She had proven that the human spirit could overcome circumstances that seemed impossible, and her story became a testament to the power of refusing to give up. Years later, when military academies taught courses on survival, escape, and evasion, Sarah's journey was used as the primary case study. Her combination of tactical skill, physical endurance, mental toughness, and pure determination had created a perfect example of human potential under extreme conditions. But Sarah herself never spoke of her experience as anything extraordinary. To her, it was simply a matter of doing whatever was necessary to get home. She had been trained to complete missions regardless of circumstances, and returning safely to friendly forces had been her mission from the moment her team was killed. The enemy had tried to leave her to die in their territory, but they had only succeeded in creating a legend that proved the extraordinary capabilities of the human spirit when faced with impossible odds. Sarah Chen's journey home had indeed become legendary, and her story would inspire others long after the war itself had become history.